I'm very pleased tonight to introduce Nancy Odegaard for our talk. I had the pleasure of actually visiting her at the Preservation Lab and getting kind of an inside glimpse into seeing what goes on there, and I was completely fascinated. So I'm very excited about tonight's talk on preserving our human heritage and how we can kind of understand what we do with human remains when they come into museums. And we had some really interesting discussions at dinner tonight. Nancy is a professor at the university, but she's not only just a professor in one department. What I thought was really interesting is she was in the engineering sciences, and I don't think I'm saying that quite right, but she'll tell you about that, as well as preservation studies and working at the Arizona State Museum. Nancy's written a number of books, and I'm really excited for her to come and actually just tell us about the latest bit of work that she's been working on. So I'm going to actually turn it over to her. And again, if you want to claim the water bottle afterwards, see me after the lecture. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Good? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming on the holiday week and for the invitation to speak. I'm talking about a couple things tonight that sort of are a spin-off of the kinds of things I'm often asked when I go overseas, related to what's it all about. And so this is a presentation in a new form that I haven't really been asked to talk about before in Tucson. So you're kind of the first. So let me try. Maybe I can use the, getting the technology. So dealing with repatriation, it's hard to say that without talking about NAGPRA, and everybody in this room must know a bit about NAGPRA, but some of our colleagues overseas are a bit confused about how it works and what it is. So I think the key word is process, that we now have a mechanism to go through to deal with human remains, the funerary objects, the sacred objects, and the objects of cultural patrimony. And you might think, well, how does that tie into conservation? It's almost the opposite of conservation. It comes in because we play a role in all of these transfers and how we look at objects, and I'll go into that a little bit further. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act really sort of identifies activities, and you can see where I've underlined kind of important things, sort of notices and databases and grants and a review committee of things and technical assistance and implementing and training. Conservation starts to feed into some of those activities in various places, and it's different in different institutions. It's hard for me to talk about repatriation without kind of bringing up the Kennewick project, which involved an enormous amount of my time from 1998 to 2011. I probably spent more time with the Kennewick remains than most people. As you remember from the famous story, there was a discovery, an inadvertent discovery by some people on government land trying to watch without paying, a boat regatta type thing. The remains were discovered and then reported to law enforcement, and law enforcement was working with a physical anthropologist, Dr. James Chatters, and he begins a study. The tribes find out, they're very upset and want to return under NAGPRA. And because it was U.S. Army Corps of Engineers land, the remains were seized with the intent of following the law. And in 1998, the Corps stabilized the area with the idea of basically preventing further excavations. So one of the big issues that we've heard about a lot is this challenging the wording that has to do with the disposition of Native American remains discovered on federal lands or curated by federal agencies, how we determine cultural affiliation with living people. And so part of the difficulty is this relating to a tribe, people, or culture that is indigenous to the United States. So this is part of how the challenge came about. And so there's a bit of redressing how we're talking about this material or materials. So a lawsuit, it's in the United States, so got to have a lawsuit, and a group of plaintiffs, 8 anthropologists. Many of you must know many of these folks, although some have passed on now, and the Asatru tribe, which is a kind of pre-Christian European community that was living in Northern California and wanted to participate, as the idea that it was their Kennewick remains were their ancestor too. The defendants in the lawsuit would be the US government, and with management with the Department of Interior, the US Army Corps of Engineers, as well as 5 Native American tribes. So basically everything was set up for a lot of stress. From the 1998 all the way to 2017, the Burke Museum, and I'll get into how they were involved, had a mandate of neutrality, and that is not taking sides. They were going to be the location, the repository for the remains. And so in practice, it's really how does one care for deceased and their belongings, and who defines that care? Like, who's the authority? What's supposed to take place? So you can, from multiple perspectives, the tribes throughout this whole number of years continuously took insults and had to defend what they thought was right. The Corps of Engineers was hit with a lot of criticism, and the litigation costs of this case are ridiculous. And the Burke Museum staff were just regularly accused of not being neutral and being inappropriate caretakers. So that was tough for them. And I think the plaintiffs were facing kind of a dramatic difficulty because changes in how DNA studies were done were taking place as they were studying. So there was a lot going on for almost everybody involved. The standards that were given to the Burke were to follow the curation of federally owned and administered archaeological collections, the 36 C.F.R. Part 79, that most museums that have anthropological collections are well aware of. And so we have these minimum standards for long-term management and care of archaeological collections, including those associated records. And all of you that have had experience at the ASM know that this is maps and data and field notes and photographs and endless amounts of material. Basically, study is allowed unless it's determined that you want to control study, encourage it, but it's as well as protect the materials. And that's what curation does. Conservation came into this project because of a demand from the Department of Justice. And they then formed a memorandum of agreement that required that the entire collection move from the Kennewick area in eastern Washington to the Burke Museum at the campus of the University of Washington. So that's really where I stepped in. Amazingly, it was a little difficult to find a conservator. It was a requirement from Justice, Department of Justice, but finding somebody that had experience with human remains collections, had familiarity with packing and conservation, familiarity with the NAGPRA law, but did not have any previous experience or interactions with the Northwest tribes that would be a conflict of interest. So that kind of came down to maybe about 4 or 5 people in the United States. So I was involved in, brought another colleague, Dr. Vicki Kassman, onto it, and as the Burke staff began working on inventory, we were asked to look at a condition assessment and to try to get the materials all in a very long, straight 36 hours from the eastern part of the state to the western part, allowing for ceremonies as well. So another difficulty in many of these cases is the Army Corps of Engineers manages the land that this all took place. The Department of Interior was managing NAGPRA. The Department of Justice was handling the legal case. And there were more attorneys than scientists involved in this at almost every meeting. So, as I said, the Justice Department requested that conservators be present, and the Army Corps of Engineers does not have their own. So these are just kind of reiterating with the conservators. It narrowed it down to very few people that could be qualified, essentially. So after that, the move began, and determining how to make a move and having to be on our feet. We had 36 hours to get through all of the material and get it packed and get the notes in order and have it delivered. So that was stressful. The government was determined to look towards whether a Native American identity and affiliation could be determined. Went through several iterations along the way. There was quite a bit of delay as the judge took several years to come to a determination that finally the remains were not Native American. And so this then would open up to further study. In other words, they did not fall under NAGPRA. They were not going to be repatriated. And so this was a study, everybody, and the verdict was a bit anticipated, and we had to be prepared for what that would mean in terms of further study. So what that meant was that the plaintiffs and their group of scientists had to produce a plan of study, and this is the list of what they proposed to do. Some of these techniques are no doubt familiar to many here. Obviously, inventory, reassembly, reconstruction, anything that was going to possibly permanently change were the things that conservation had to determine an alternative and kind of argue that there might be a better way. So we were pretty concerned about re-adhering with adhesives, commercial adhesives. We were, the idea of removing the embedded point from the pelvis area, that was not going to happen. How much sampling, how many fragments could be available. Those were all a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth, even talking about the dental peels and whether, which material were you going to use, how were you going to do it, was it going to be how many of the teeth, so on. So there was a lot of discussion. Anything that was essentially non-destructive or non-invasive, like the x-rays, the CT scans, those went along with more speed. So for 2 years, the plaintiffs organized teams and brought in section experts to do measurements, look at paleopathology issues, taphonomic analysis, photography, What's interesting is the layers of researchers that came in did not want to use the data of previous researchers. So they wanted new x-rays and new CTs and new dental peels. So this began to be a bit of a caution where anytime we have researchers coming in to use collections, you want to say, you know, what is your point? What do you want to study? What's your justification? And those researchers that didn't have a good explanation, they just kind of wanted to be there, were given a harder time, like, no, write a better justification to go forward. We did have some things that were a bit difficult. Some of the photographic methods, the placement, slide in the middle, sort of standing long bones up on their ends. These made us really nervous. We had instances where we said, no, you can't use a dental peel in this area. And they did anyway because we found the blue president silicone. So it was constant trying to be neutral, trying to work with researchers under very restrictive conditions, time-sensitive conditions. Be helpful, but also be protective was our goal. So after 14 years of study, 14 years since the discovery, and then 12 years of research studies, the sessions, 8 sessions, the defendants had 3, the plaintiffs had 5. The research days were 137 days. Again, the breakdown there, the plaintiffs had a lot of time. The total number of different researchers were 33 people, and that meant this averages out, we had 29 conservation assessments. So this is something that takes about a day. It's a lot of time and a lot of different things going on in a single room all the way through. So some of the types of tasks that we had to do according to the Department of Justice was to examine and monitor for deterioration and other changes. We're talking about over 200 fragments that each had to have their own entry, and we had to be prepared to talk about any change that took place as a result of one of those research sessions. So we worked on developing a way that we could do that. We also needed to review and evaluate the environmental conditions. We were, I would say, multiple times a year criticized, or the Burke was criticized for the environmental conditions, that they probably weren't good enough. We argued that they were okay. But the technique we used to measure the change in condition had a lot to do with what was coming off. And so we used a scale where we could give a record. There was minor soil coming off, or there was significant soil deposition. There were minute bone fragments being redeposited in the boxes, or there were enough fragments that we had to store them a little bit separately, or increase cracking. This technique allowed us to go through and see. So we were looking at what was coming off and assuming that what was still in the integrity of the box was holding up. So we began tracking the condition. And so what's going on here is these are the assessment time periods, and basically after every research session, we have a spike in the percent of soil and bone that's coming off. We expected that, but we can also tell then what kinds of studies cause more dramatic damage. We also began organizing, for example, how much attention different fragments were getting in terms of research studies. So every fragment had a number, unique, had a box location, a name, and then of these different studies, you can see here on the example, we ticked off a number of things and then listed people below. There was a commitment made by every researcher that came in that they would provide copies of their data, of their notes, and these would be kept as an archive. Not everybody did that. There was also a commitment that they would publish their work, and not everybody did that. So for the record, we were able to know who and when was there and what they worked on. There was another issue that was kind of interesting and new to us in that there were loans made for certain types of analysis. The bone, particularly as I mentioned, the DNA studies were evolving and changing over this time period. There were new advances being made. And one of the things that's very difficult is, for all museums in loaning material, is when the loanee decides to make subloans and doesn't tell the institution. So one of the difficulties were these subloans that you can see marked there that ended up being like a difficulty in tracking. And it was really only after the staff began questioning borrowers did they learn that they had been, the sample that they were given had been divided and tested again. So some of those had no requirement to return, and I suspect this is happening in other places. So looking back, Conservation was tasked to develop an efficient assessment protocol and track 340 fragments on a regular basis during all those years. Conservation had to be ready for all the intensive study sessions with a full range of techniques. We had to be ready to provide tools, materials, and support and assistance, basically, to what was coming without necessarily knowing what people wanted to do. And Conservation offered really new tools for temporary refitting. We really put a stop to a researcher permanently readhering fragments together. And we kind of, I think, tried to help develop a teamwork setting so that there wasn't a hovering over one location. Researchers could be set up with microscopes or equipment that they brought, and we could bring sections, anatomical sections, to the right person without having to lean over the entire. Right? This is our publication. Vicki Kassman and I worked on this, and really there was a lot that we learned from the Kennewick process in these chapters. The red ones are directly related to the Kennewick project. So what happened then? The plaintiffs, under the leadership of Doug Owsley, produced in 2014 a book that was started in the late 90s, and really went on to talk about the process and all the studies that they did. There's of course ongoing controversy that went on, and it was a bit interesting. Owsley stuck to his guns all the way through that the Kennewick remains were not linked to the tribes. And there were people on the team, his team, that were doing some DNA and had already begun to suspect and pretty much prove that their remains were related. And there was also the ongoing involvement of James Chatters, and so he continued to be kind of a third wheel on the project throughout. Of course, the Kennewick's not the only set of remains that have had a lot of attention. Most of these names may be familiar to you of other remains that have been studied. Not all of the studies have been contentious or gone into litigation. I think people, the tribes, the government, the scientists, the museum collection managers and curators all learned a lot about wanting to avoid another Kennewick-like case. The part of the work that's been so fascinating is the role of the DNA studies. I want to sort of point out that Tom Stafford, U of A graduate, that was part of Owsley's team, had begun working with a question about the DNA and getting samples, and we knew there were some difficulties. The first studies with DNA had come back inconclusive. And Tom was standing around, and it occurred to him that the DNA was not inside the bone, but was probably on the outside in the rind because of the wet conditions. So he wanted to sort of prove that. During the time of the Kennewick research, he moved to Denmark and was working in Dr. Willersleev's lab. And so a lot of new things started coming out. But one of the things that I think is really great is that when we said no more sampling, what do you think you can do with the samples that have already been taken? And he thought about that and said, well, that's the part that I was actually interested in. That's the part that was cut away. Can I have some of the already sampled material to try again? And so he worked with his team and had another technique, and actually has improved, and they do now do DNA much that way, or things have gone much further. There's a lot more data, there's a lot more technique. So I like to think that that restriction, that you can't have more sample, forced a researcher to find a new way to use the old sample and actually make an advancement that benefits everything. There's a lot of discussion about, you know, how the DNA is playing a role. Some of these illustrations we've seen, and there's just been even new things coming out all the time. Dr. Willerslev was, I met him a few years ago, and he gives a lot of credit to the Kennewick project and the difficulties, and now has a different tact in dealing with the tribal communities and with scientists, other scientists. And I think that, so while it was kind of a drawn out, expensive, and difficult project, there's been a lot of advancement as a result. People have gone different ways. This is a picture of him, and his conclusions are certainly that the Kennewick remains are very closely related to contemporary Native Americans. And so I think that it's now, and of course, the remains have been returned, and we are further all through the process. Some of these books and covers probably look familiar. There was a lot of talk. A lot of us for years were not allowed. Justice Department told us not to speak to the press, so there were not a lot of presentations, not a lot of discussions in class because it was discouraged. But certainly later more has come out. I think when, and it's really just last year, in 2017, when the remains known as Kennewick Man, and how the Ancient One, or his name, were put to rest with relatives. And the interesting thing was that the genetic science was able to prove, and all the other invasive studies that are so common were kind of proved to be a difficulty. And that's a little bit to think about with our archaeological science. So where do things go, and with the field and conservation, and where does conservation fit in at the Arizona State Museum? Well, we're pretty much involved with every transaction that goes along. We sort of come in after there's been a reassembly of the entire burial, the associated funerary belongings, the research samples. Everything's brought together by many, many hardworking people. The inventory, the database, the publication of the inventory, the go-ahead, the tribal communications. And it's really after quite a bit has happened that conservation steps in, goes into where the materials have been collected, and looks for several things. We examine everything that's going to be returned. We look for previous treatments and alterations. We detect pesticide residues because sometimes they're there on either the remains or on the associated objects. And we check for labels and markings because we have lighting and magnification that some of the other people working in the museum don't have. And then finally, we have been given the responsibility to reassemble in the packing. And packing for repatriation is pretty different from other packing. We sort of have difficulties knowing what we're going to do. So this involves consultation. How do you want to receive the material? What is appropriate? So we try to use consultations to guide us with access, use, how we organize our storage, how we examine, sample, and pack, and certainly how we involve ourselves with conservation treatment. So we're trying always to do a little better job. And I think I've got something out of order. So this is just all kinds of different objects are in museums. Sometimes they have pesticides, and that's been a big research area for us, is these hidden things. The picture up here on the upper left is from another museum, but it's dated to 1911, and it's just been poisoned. And so it takes a little deciphering, but what that means on that object is that there's lots of arsenic. The tag over here that says cyberized is a museum tag, and that also means arsenic. The object down below, on the lower left there, was quite a bit of study because it's an archaeological fragment of a moccasin, and the idea was it part of the soil deposit? Was it part of use? Was it a pigment? And through analysis, it's DDT, which was put on everything that came from that excavation. The bone skull there, animal bone, has a funny color. See how dark gray it is? Well, that is changing mercury. So that's what's going on there, and the white powder in the featherwork here is arsenic. Luckily, the Arizona State Museum, we don't have too much with arsenic and mercury, a little bit. But for about 2 decades, one of the curators liked to use a product that had zinc. And that's what's all over the little doll on the right there. Zinc's not as toxic. I mean, people take vitamin zinc. So luckily, that's not a human health hazard. It's just kind of an annoyance to find it on things where it shouldn't be. So we have developed a lot of team projects. Some of you may know I've done a lot of work across the United States and here in Arizona, working with tribes who have received repatriated objects and are concerned about the human health hazard. We organized the first conference on this. We took information to each of the tribes in Arizona. And since then, worked with the Department of Chemistry and with the Poison Control Center and School of Medicine to really work on doing studies and then in turn doing a workshop every time we do a study. So we've done those in various places in the country, and even many years later, I still have a request. I'm going to be going in a couple months up to Saskatoon in Canada to help a group of intertribal museum centers come together and try to understand how pesticides got onto collections and what they need to know to keep themselves safe. So We have focused primarily on the inorganic persistent pesticides, the arsenic, lead, mercury are a concern, and studied when they were in use and when they're being discontinued. We've done a lot of innovative work using a portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. You've probably seen those. They're pretty widespread now and used in a lot of different ways. We've gone through 3 of them at the Arizona State Museum and continue to use this to determine the presence of elements such as these metal dusts. And then what's a little bit unique about what our team does is that we created a formula that allows us to estimate the dose. And then once we can estimate the dose, medical literature can help clarify what the human health hazard is. So right now, I think we're the only people doing that. So we can create a database. In this example, I'm showing Navajo rugs because normally we can't talk about the repatriated material in a public context. But we'll create and get these readings, we'll get data and begin to sort of translate. Our goal has been to try to figure out what is the risk and then what can we do. So we have been studying and researching ways of removal. And we have successfully removed arsenic from some textiles, and I've removed arsenic from 3 culturally repatriated objects for one of the tribes. This is an example of our repatriation after we've tested everything, how we kind of pack for repatriation. There's no rules out there. We didn't even know if we were doing the right thing. I like to say, I'm not even sure we are, except when I get a call from another museum that says, the tribe has asked us to call you to do it the way you're doing it. So then I figure, well, it can't be all wrong because they're recommending other museums call us. We use a process where the collection, the belongings and the remains are all brought together. They're organized. We use clean grocery bags that we purchase. And this allows us to have that material that is not synthetic, a typical request, so paper. And because of the engineering of a grocery bag, we have the strength down below, and we have this somewhat flexible shape. So you can see the bags in the picture, and then our museum, the Arizona State Museum, uses pink tags to kind of highlight items that are part of repatriation. So where do materials go? They might go to the community, near the community for reburial. They might go to regular cemeteries. They may go to water. They may go out in the desert. I don't actually know. We've had some repatriations where we've been directly involved with the reinterment, but many times we just don't necessarily know. The overall view of dealing with human remains, and there may be some physical anthropologists here that have other ideas, but it's not a typical place for an art conservator to find themselves. And I feel that through the process that I've seen with the Kennewick Remains and other projects, that I often go back and tell students to look at this Vermilion Accord from 1989, and to the key words here, it jumps out right away with every dot, is respect. And so this is really where we are now, is respect and agreement. And I think it's kind of exciting that I was recently involved in some meetings at the Field Museum. And what was interesting there was to hear tribal representatives talking about their DNA projects. And this is after all the controversy and all the difficulty. This group is no doubt familiar with the Havasupai case in Arizona State University and using DNA data differently, but it's respecting what a tribe wants to do for their own research and then participating and helping. And so I was very impressed with some of the researchers that were invited as well, and with the ability of the many tribal representatives to express why they wanted to control the study and what they really wanted to know. So there were many examples that included migration and interrelationships between the tribes, and so there's a lot more going on out there. I thought that was pretty interesting. I think we're still working in museums to try to collaborate better on everything, not just repatriation. And so bringing people into a lab situation, as those of you who've been in our lab know, it's pretty dynamic, it's changing all the time. It's a good place to come together for discussions, and sometimes our repatriation discussions have taken place there. One of the things I'd like to try to do in the future is, to have tribes decide what kinds of objects they think have problems, and to bring those to the museum and gather a group and talk about things from their perspective. To that end, I've been involved for the last several years with a project at the School for Advanced Research that has recently completed an initiative to develop guidelines for communities to museums and museums to communities. And this fully collaborative project started in one area and moved to a completely different area in terms of the tone and in terms of the detail and in terms of what was considered important. The best thing about it was that both were being worked on, first community and museum, and then the museum and community, and just bringing that all together. So those guidelines are available on their website, and I think they're a big move forward, and many museums, including the Arizona State Museum, are always trying to do it better. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
How do you dispose of the toxic material that you're removing from some of these objects?
So it depends. It's always my answer, isn't it? What is the poison, and how much do we have, and where is it going? So I actually worked with a single object that had enough poison on it to be a toxic waste site in its own right. That object really was recommended for, this has to be isolated. People shouldn't be handling it at all. That object was going to go into, well, the idea was cultural use again, but it can vary. When we can remove, we often get it to a dilution point. So arsenic, for example, is very water soluble, goes into solution. So if we can quantify how much we have and then use a volume of water, we can get to a dilution that we can dispose of it. Other things are much more difficult, and then we have to work with our risk management. The problem is that if I'm working with a tribal community and they want to change something, then we have to talk a little bit about, well, where would you put that? And if I tell you what it is and how much it is, can you determine a place that's safe? So it's a dialogue. Yeah.
Arsenic and the other toxins are primarily to keep insects, especially things like carpet beetles, dermestids, from eating wool or feathers or animal skins, or in case I'm an entomologist, eating other insects. So I'm here in the entomology department, and we've, for a number of years, totally gotten away from the old bad guys of parabenzene, naphthalene, shell and pest strips, bicona, all that stuff. So basically, when something comes in, or every few years, we deep freeze it in an ultra cold at -80 for about a week, and that kills everything that's in it. Any pest is going bye-bye at -80. So
You don't even have to go that cold for most objects. We were actually the first museum to do freezing.
Okay, so you routinely do that now?
We do. We've been doing it since the early 80s. And it was actually, I was working in Boston and was at a museum pest conference at MIT. And there were all these papers, and it was a comment from the audience that somebody got up and said, you know, why isn't somebody trying freezing? So we did a number of experiments, and anecdotally, my first day at Arizona State Museum, I was greeted with, we have a disaster in room 328, and it's completely infested. What can you do about it? And it was actually the dairy school that helped us out. We started freezing pretty much right away. And then got a grant, got a freezer, and moved on. But thank you, yes, that's exactly right. We do recommend freezing to people. Yeah.
How much can you speak a little bit about once Kennewick was found, the man was found, and the local law enforcement, and how the bones were handled at that point until you guys got involved?
Yeah, that was, well, there's a little bit of a murky story there. When law enforcement, so it was sheriff's department for that area, got involved and then called when it was human, and at that point they thought it was maybe from last year, homicide or something. It was very unclear. And I will back up and say this is the story I've heard. I wasn't involved at that point, so this was, by the time I was involved, this was a story. The sheriff then called the physical anthropologist James Chatters that they frequently worked with. He took the remains home and set them out on his dining room table and began working on them. Once they were going to be seized, they were seized from his home and taken to a federal building. It wasn't a lab, it was just a kind of a government storage building. What was unknown for many years was that some of the bones were put into a cardboard box and slipped to the sheriff to save some of the long bones. And so the sheriff took those and put them in the sheriff's station in the evidence lockup room without any identification. So when the remains were being inventoried to go from the Kennewick area to the Burke, this quick inventory was done and bones were missing. And the Corps was blamed for mismanagement and care. But in actuality, those bones were in the sheriff's office, which they forgot about. And when they tore down the sheriff's office and were clearing it out, they found the box. And the box was something like a Wisconsin cheese company addressed to James Chatters. So, where did it come from? How did they appear? The story got a little more complete. So that's this idea of tracking, and museums really do want to track what they're doing. So the mix-up was that the remains were in somebody's personal home, and while he had them, he actually started putting things together. So he puts a coating on some of the remains. He was reassembling the cranium and using, I would say, products we don't use in a museum. Think hardware store. And rubber bands and products that maybe he had at home. He was pretty reluctant to talk, but after a couple of years, we got to know each other, and he started telling us, because we were trying to explain why something looked the way it did. So that's the kind of thing that was going on.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's fascinating, personally.
Yeah, I'm pretty fascinated in treatments myself. So there was just kind of an intrigue. There was just limited time. Dr. Chatters had been cleaning. Most of the materials were just caked with mud. It came out of a river bank. So they're getting to what things were, and then that 36-hour marathon. Doug Owsley was there, James Chatters was there, and Vicki Castleman and I were there, and 2 people from the Burke and 3 people from the Corps. But it was just running out of time. And then outside, the tribes were wanting to come in and bless and perform ceremony. So it was pretty busy. Yeah.
Did you already say, and I just forgot, what is the age of Kennewick Man?
A little over 9,000 years old, or roughly 9,000. It might be a little bit less. That was one thing too. The dating, based on the sample, was it was sent to the samples were sent to 3 labs, and it was a little inconclusive. I mean, they didn't all. 2 did not get a signal reading, and the 3rd, it was they were hedging a little bit, but that's about where it is. Yeah.
Who put the 36-hour time frame together? Why wasn't there?
That's interesting. That's a good question. That was because nobody thought it could possibly take that long to just go through fragments. Well, the people organizing this were not thinking about archaeology and how long it takes to look at a small archaeological fragment covered in dirt and know how to categorize it, identify it, label it, and do a condition assessment. So it became really awkward. Part of the push in not being able to make that go longer was that there were kind of semi-riots taking place. So there were helicopter escorts, an armored car, and imaging, photographs, and filming going on the whole time. It was pretty amazing. And so all of that was in a series of protected vehicles and armed guards. I was just in somebody's station wagon trying to sort through documents so that when we got there. My concern, thinking in terms of what this material, the climate in eastern Washington is very different than the coast. And everything was going to have to be counted again. So I had to quickly think of how can we package this to not just have a crazy mess at the other end. So that was really, that was kind of the on the spot, what can we get, what can we do? But we were truly working for 36 hours straight without a break, any real break. They had bought us hotel rooms, but we never saw them. So it was just getting that. And then the big, a lot of chaos was going on right at the Berg. But we just walked right by the crowd. Nobody knew us from anything, so it was nice to be a little stealth. Well, thank you.